know your stuff.
I did my report on George Washington Carver. He was a botanist, an educator, a scientist, a zoologist, and an inventor. He was born in 1864 and he died in 1943. George made products from sweet potatoes and peanuts. Some things he made from peanuts are washing powder, bleach, shoe polish, metal polish, ink, rubbing oil, cooking oil, axle grease, cattle feed, sturdy dyes, plastic, shampoo, soap, shaving cream, linoleum, and rubber. George made over 300 products using peanuts. Things George made from sweet potatoes are 17 laborers, 14 candies, 5 pastes, 5 breakfast foods, 4 starches, 4 flours, 3 molasses, vinegar, and coffee. Altogether, George made 118 products using sweet potatoes. George Washington Carver earned the Green Arm Medal by the NAACP to one African American each year for outstanding achievement. George Washington Carver was an educator, inventor, scientist, botanist, and a zoologist. He's known for making hundreds of things from peanuts and sweet potatoes. He lived his life wanting to help others. In 1864, George was born into slavery. Mr. and Mrs. Carver owned George's mother, so when George was born, the Carvers owned George too. When George was a week old, him and his mother were kidnapped. The kidnappers sold them for money, but Mr. Carver hired a man to find them, but he only found George. He never saw his mother again. Mr. and Mrs. Carver raised George as their own child. Mrs. Carver taught George how to read and write because black people were not allowed at the public schools where he lived. George found a school for black children about 10 miles away, so he decided to go there. He met a lady named Mariah Watkins and rented a room from her. He told her he was Carver's George, and she told him from that point on his name was George Carver. She told George, "You must learn all you can, then go back out into the world and give your learning back to the people." So that is what George did. When George was 13, he moved to Kansas, where he went to several schools and earned his diploma. He moved to Iowa, and in 1891, he was the first black student at Iowa State Agricultural College. Later on, he was the first black teacher here. In 1896, George started to run the agricultural department at Tuskegee Institute. He taught there for 47 years. He taught crop rotation and farming ideas that would help people survive. He taught farmers to put nitrogen back into the soil by alternating cotton crops with sweet potatoes or peanuts. This also helped farmers have food for their families. When George was in his 70s, he created the George Washington Carver Foundation at Tuskegee. George was important to many people, even some presidents. In 1943, Franklin D. Roosevelt dedicated $30,000 for the George Washington Carver National Monument. This was the first national monument dedicated to an African American and the first to honor someone besides the president. George was on a U.S. stamp in 1943 and 1998. His picture was on a half-dollar coin from 1951 to 1954. Two ships were named after George, the SS George Washington Carver and the USS George Washington Carver. In 1977, George was elected to the Hall of Fame for Great Americans. In 1990, George was inducted to the National Inventors Hall of Fame. In 1999, Iowa State University awarded George to the Doctor of Humane Letters. In 2000, George was inducted to the USDA Hall of Heroes. In 2002, a scholar listed George on his list of 100 great African Americans. In 2005, George's research at the Tuskegee Institute was dedicated as a National Chemical Landmark. Also in 2005, the Missouri Botanical Garden opened George Washington Carver Garden in his honor, which includes a life-size statue of George. Dozens of schools are named after George. In his lifetime, George developed 118 products using sweet potatoes and 325 products using peanuts and 75 products using pecans. George also came up with a process to make plastic from soybeans. It was used to make cars. George died on January 5, 1943, when he was 78 years old. He was buried at Tuskegee University.